Hi everyone, my name is Tara Rudo and I'm a Marine Education Specialist at the Chesapeake Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve in Virginia. And we are located at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. And today we're going to be discussing how human impacts can play a role in pollution in our local waterways and eventually our ocean. And to do that, we're going to be using an enviroscape. An enviroscape is a tool used by educators to teach about how those human impacts impact our local waterways and our ocean, and it's meant to show a watershed. So a watershed is an area of land where all the local tributaries and bodies of water will drain down to one common body of water. So we're located in Gloucester Point, Virginia, so we're part of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So all those tributaries will run into the bay and then eventually into the Atlantic Ocean. Now on our enviroscape, you'll notice there's various zones within our watershed. We have areas where farming is going on, so agricultural. We have our industrial area and our residential. And of course, people love to come to the coast for vacation, so we have more of our tourism area as well. So all of these zones are comprised within our watershed. So even though some might be further away from the coastline, those are still going to have some impacts on our coastline. And we're going to be discussing some of those common pollutants that we find in our watershed today. Sediment is represented by our coffee grounds. Sediment can become a pollutant if too much of it drains into waterways. It can cloud the water and affect the ability of some organisms to see and breathe. Trash or litter is represented by our sprinkles. Trash can easily enter waterways and harm wildlife. Fertilizers are represented by our red Kool-Aid. People will put fertilizers on their crops, vegetables, flowers, or lawns to help them flourish. Fertilizers contain a lot of nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, which are necessary for plant growth, but can have negative effects if there's too much of them in our waterways. Our pesticides are represented by our purple Kool-Aid. Pesticides are chemicals people will use on their crops or lawns to prevent insects and pests from harming their plants. And finally, we have motor oil, which is represented by maple syrup. Motor oil can leak from cars and wash down into storm drains and eventually into our waterways. The first pollutant to deposit onto our watershed is the motor oil. Again, this pollutant is caused by motor vehicles. Motor oil will be found where there are impervious surfaces such as roads and parking lots. Litter or trash will be deposited onto our watershed where there are high concentrations of people, like in our residential and tourist areas. The next pollutant are our pesticides. They are going to be found where people are tending to lush green areas. We can find the use of pesticides in agricultural and residential areas, and golf courses may even use them along their fairways. Similar to pesticides, fertilizers are used in places to help plants and crops grow. They are most commonly found in agricultural areas. They are one of the top pollutants in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Sediments can be found all across a watershed. In agricultural and industrial areas, you can see plowing of land, which will increase the chance of sediment runoff. Construction in residential areas can lead to an increase in runoff as well. Now that all the pollutants have been deposited onto the watershed, what will happen when a rainstorm comes? Storms are very common in warmer months of the year. They can move from inland down to the coast. Take a look and see what happens to our pollutants during the storm. So now that our rainstorm has come and gone, you can tell that our enviroscape looks a lot different than it did before. So you'll notice a lot of the pollutants that we deposited earlier have now made their way into those local tributaries and waterways and eventually down into that common body of water. So here in our watershed, that being the Chesapeake Bay. So for instance, our fertilizers and pesticides, it's the Kool-Aid, so the color of the water has definitely changed, but those are definitely going to cause things like harmful algae blooms. And that can really affect a lot of marine life. It can deplete a lot of the dissolved oxygen in the water. We have our excess sediment here, so when that washes in the water, that can actually be harmful. It can cause the water to be really cloudy and affect species like our seagrasses. So sunlight can't penetrate down and reach our seagrass beds and allow them to thrive. And then we also have things like our trash and our debris. So some marine life might ingest those materials or get entangled into them. So even though we find a lot of these pollutants on land, they do make their way into our waterways, and that can be extremely harmful for our marine life.
Waterways play important roles for animals, plants, and people. There are ways that we can mitigate negative impacts and prevent these pollutants from entering our waterways in the first place. Best management practices, or BMPs, are ways to prevent or reduce the amount of pollution generated by non-point source pollutants from entering waterways. One example are rain barrels. They collect and store rainwater that could otherwise be lost to runoff. That water can then be used for washing cars or even gardening. Rain gardens are depressed areas in the landscape that collect rainwater and allows it to soak into the ground. Planted with native plant species, rain gardens can be a cost-effective and beautiful way to reduce runoff. Starting your own compost bin allows for less waste to go to landfills, and it also allows gardens to have improved soil moisture retention. Conducting beach or local cleanups can prevent litter from entering waterways. Making choices to dispose of waste properly, or even using eco-friendly products can help too. And of course, educating others about the impacts humans have on our watershed brings awareness to the topic and gets local communities involved in keeping the bay beautiful.